Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Subtext Podcast Archives. These are the long-lost episodes of the Subtext that were originally produced between 2015 and 2017. In 2018, the Subtext moved to American Theater Magazine, and we've been producing the pod there monthly ever since. These time capsules are being shared here in their entirety, including plenty of outdated references and advertisements for events far in the past. If you enjoy them, please subscribe to the current podcast feed for the Subtext or stream new episodes on the website for American Theater Magazine. Thank you for listening. I'm a writer, and obviously I love to tell stories, but I don't come from a family of writers or storytellers or artists of any kind. I was never set on a trajectory into the arts or into writing as a young kid, and that might be part of the reason why I'm such a late bloomer. My family doesn't have many anecdotes told over the holiday dinner table. Both sides of my family are somewhat mysterious to me. One of them because we have been estranged for most of my life. But the other side, my mother's side, is mysterious simply because we aren't talkers. The stories haven't been handed down through the generations. During the last couple years of my grandfather's life, I would try and spend as much time with him as I could. Henry was in his 90s, and I knew our time together was coming to an end. He lived 1 year after my grandmother died, and during one of my visits, he told me he started to write his life story. He even showed me the yellow legal pads he was writing on. It looked like he had pages and pages already written. He said, "I want to leave something behind when I'm gone." We never really talked about the content. About a year passes, and I make another visit. I mean, obviously there are many visits in between, but after about a year, I come back to visit my grandfather Henry. It had been a long time since he mentioned his writing, so I asked about how it was coming along. He told me he threw it all away. It was garbage, he said. There were some things I decided were better left unsaid, he told me. I didn't ask him for any specifics. That's not how we communicated. I also didn't tell him that I was disappointed. I only said, "Oh yeah? Nobody wants to read that stuff anyway," he said. And that wasn't entirely true. I did. I desperately wanted to read it. I finished my visit after some small talk about weather or something equally mundane. I said my goodbyes and headed back on the road to Boston, where I was living at the time. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last chance I'd have to speak with him. He was on his deathbed only a few days later, and when I returned to say goodbye, it was all he could do to breathe. I wasn't a writer at the time this all happened, but later as I started to write my own stories in the form of plays, I thought about what my grandfather might have said about his own life. What was he proud of? What shamed him so much he had to throw his own story away? Writing gives us eternal life in a sort of way, doesn't it? So I try to give that to my grandfather by planting little bits of him into characters I write. Sometimes it's obvious, like when I name somebody Henry. Sometimes it's a memory I have of him that wouldn't mean anything to an actor or an audience. Those are just for me, so he can be part of the story of me, so in some small way, he can be part of my eternal life. Welcome to the Subtext. This is episode 24. That marks 2 years of this podcast. We only do one a month, so 24 in 2 years. I don't know why I find it surprising we have lasted this long, but I do. I recently went back to episode 1 with Madhuri Shaker to think back on where we both were at the time, and it's sort of awesome to listen to Madhuri talk about her writing, what she hoped to do next, and talk about that upcoming production she had in LA at the time. And what's remarkable is in the time since she and I spoke, she has gone on to do some great things. She's finishing her first year at Juilliard, just had a fantastic production of a new play at Victory Gardens in Chicago, and she's getting married this summer in India. That's just awesome. I like to think this podcast is a small marker in time for the playwrights I interview, and for myself in a smaller way. Maybe I'll check back with some writers in the future and see what has happened in the time since we first spoke. that's an idea for another day. In the meantime, I have another interview to conduct. This month, I am speaking with playwright and poet Dan O'Brien. Dan's newest play, titled The House in Scarsdale, a memoir for the stage, is opening at Boston Court in Pasadena on May 6th and runs through June 4th. That's 2017 for those of you listening in the near future or the distant future. And full disclosure, Boston Court is my day job. I've been a huge fan of Dan's work since first encountering his play The Body of an American and the collection of poetry War Reporter several years ago. Dan's work is stunningly poetic and deeply human. Pick up one of his collections of poetry and see his plays perform live. I command you, after you listen to us talk for an hour. But first, let's get into the interview. Every episode opens with a monologue or an anecdote of sorts, and usually they're not even related to who I'm interviewing. They're just whatever's on my mind. But because I've been living in Scarsdale for so long,
I'm sorry. My apologies.
That this one's about my family. Like, it has me thinking about my family.
Right.
That's what this play is doing.
Oh, good.
To everybody.
That's what I hope it does. It's okay.
It's what everybody's doing. Like, we're all examining our relationships to our family, and that's where my headspace has been.
Everyone's calling up their parents and saying, listen.
Right, yeah.
That thing you said in 1997, bugging me for 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, I have a challenged relationship with my own family, and
Oh, really?
I'm from New England, I'm from New Hampshire, and
I think I knew that. What part of New Hampshire?
Keene. Yeah, we talked about it. You got married in New Hampshire.
Yeah, Jessica's parents they sort of retired there to New London.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
New London, New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like that's one of those towns where there's 6 of them. There's one in every.
Right.
There's one in every
True.
State of
That's
New England.
True. Yeah, there's New London, Connecticut for sure. Yeah.
I kind of love living very far away from New England and interacting with people who have never experienced the Northeast,
Right.
and think that New England is also a state of its own. What's the capital of New England?
It's like people that think Africa is a country.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's.
So how long ago? So you came out here for school?
No, I came out here to be a writer.
Oh, okay.
My spouse at the time and I were writing partners.
Okay.
And I had recently. I mean, I like that we're starting with a mini interview of me. Mm-hmm. It was 2007, and I was trying to leave a corporate life.
Oh, okay.
I had been out of undergrad for, a decade, a little over a decade, and had been trying to find myself through all of these. I had all these jobs, and I was doing well in all these corporate jobs, and then acting on the side.
What kind of corporate jobs?
I was working as a paralegal for a while at a corporate paralegal firm. I was working as a consultant for this marketing agency, and I had clients like Amex and General Motors.
This was all in New York?
This is out of Boston.
Out of Boston, okay.
Yeah. I was like a business traveler. I was flying to Detroit for meetings in a suit. And it was kind of hilarious because I look younger than I am. And when I was 28, I looked about 17.
Right.
So it was like, who brought the intern? Why is the intern
You were like
talking to us?
Doogie Howser of
And
consulting.
I'd be in this like tower in Detroit, one of the GM towers, in very traditional giant boardroom with men with guts in blue suits talking about the golf trip they're taking this weekend. And then here's this kid who's like writing little scenes because he's trying to be a playwright. Like that's
so
what's
you already
happening.
knew then you wanted to write.
That's what I was figuring, because I was a terrible actor.
Okay.
That's where I started, was trying to be an actor in my 20s, and I just wasn't very good at it, and I didn't connect to it. Like, I felt, this doesn't feel right.
But you wanted to do it. That's interesting. I mean, like, you still had that ambition.
Well, the ambition to act came out of a desire for attention.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then a self-awareness of actually not being any good at it got me to take the next step, which was to start writing.
Right. Start doing that easier thing.
Yeah, where
writing plays.
Well,
right. So
right.
much more lucrative.
It's so much more lucrative. But it's also the you can start off slower and with less judgment because the judgment.
And you can write for yourself. I mean, you own, it's your script. You know, if nobody produces it, fine, but you still made it.
Right.
It's a little harder as an actor if you're not getting any roles, unless you create your own roles,
right.
obviously. Otherwise, you're just kind of waiting around for somebody to cast you, right?
Yeah.
And that's a real.
So what I know
a tough life.
You acted a little bit, right? Because I've seen photos.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Old production photos of you.
I did a very little bit. I mean, I acted a lot in college for sure. I mean, I think the people in my theater department probably thought I would go on acting. I mean, I was one of those undergraduates that did a ton of acting and loved it. But I always thought of myself as a writer. I mean, I also wrote plays in college, but I also wrote fiction and poetry. So I sort of had a bit of a bifurcated education of, writing on one hand and then acting and a little bit of directing on the other. So, but I ended up kind of just going the playwriting route because, God, for a lot of reasons. I mean, the play I wrote as an undergrad won the Kennedy Center's National Student Playwriting Award, and that was probably a big reason that I started following that sort of trail as opposed to acting more or, I don't know, writing novels. I mean, I wrote a novel as my undergraduate thesis that's, or I tried to write a novel that's probably unreadable, and
but it was the greatest thing.
Yeah,
at the time,
it was going to be the greatest thing.
Yeah.
I mean, a couple things happened. One is I got this thing called a Watson Fellowship when I was just out of college. You apply when you're a senior at if you are lucky enough to go to one of 60 liberal arts colleges around the country, and the Watson Foundation pays for 60 students after college to go anywhere in the world that they propose to go if they, make a decent pitch for why they, why this would change their life, in theory. So it's all about independent study, and you go alone, and they don't want you to go home. They don't want you to enroll anywhere, so it's really like life experience type of study. So I had one of the easier proposals in that I was going to go to Ireland for a year, where I could more or less speak English to people who more or less spoke English.
Yeah.
I have a good friend of mine who's actually a well-known actor and writer now, Jason Mantzoukas, who's a comedian or comic actor.
Right.
He was my friend undergraduate, and he got a Watson Fellowship the same year and went to Northern Africa to study the influence of American jazz music on contemporary music in Northern Africa. And when he got the fellowship, he said to me, now I have to find out if there is jazz music in Northern Africa. It truly, it was a passion of his, but he didn't really know what he was doing. But yeah, neither did I. I mean, I was going to, quote unquote, study Irish folklore and mythology as it related to Irish theater, modern Irish theater, while at the same time, and do so by acting in plays if I could get cast, and writing while I was there.
Now, was this a sincere? I mean, you're young, so when you're young, you just try to get the things you can get. Was this like a sincere endeavor, or were you just trying to get to Ireland so you could be in Ireland?
It truly was. That feeling, I mean, again, I was 22 when I proposed it, but it was that feeling of this is my destiny.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, I think I said in the interview, because there's a process of your school has to pick you, then they pass you on to the Watson Foundation, and the president of the Watson Foundation comes through each college town and interviews you. And one of the big interviews, I think I said, I just felt that I needed to return home, or I needed to come home to Ireland or something like that, which of course is ridiculous because I'd never been there in the first place. And my Irish roots go back very far in this country. My American roots go back very far, And in the years since, I found out, how much more of an American mutt I am than, but the Irish myth for me as a child was hugely strong. In terms of my identity and in terms of the writers that meant a lot to me. So it was completely earnest to want to return home. I can see now with years, and this is how it relates a bit to the house in Scarsdale, I can see now how much it relates to, my lack of a father. I had a father who I grew up with, but at best he was, emotionally absent. At worst, he was emotionally and verbally abusive. And on some level, because his family was very Irish and is very Irish American. I think going to Ireland was my attempt to sort of connect with that side of that branch of whoever I was or whoever I thought I was. Because my mother's family, I kind of knew a little bit growing up, and those are the people we mostly see in the play.
Mm-hmm.
In the house in Scarsdale are mostly my mother's relatives because they were strange and estranged, but there was some relationship there. Whereas my father's family was like a complete mystery to me.
Yeah, it's interesting how the character of your father is created in the play, and then he appears for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
just for
this brief moment, this mysterious man exists for us, and it's really kind of it makes me feel like God, I had for the briefest moment I had something really profound and metaphorical to say, and how to describe how I felt in that moment, because I have my own daddy issues that I've talked about on this podcast before, so I won't get into it again.
Hey, as you should. What kind of playwright would you be without some daddy and or mother?
But the thing I wanted to ask about was your relationship to Ireland and your Irish roots that you just talked about. Is the fact that you have an Irish last name, does that make you feel did that growing up make you feel that much more Irish, and that puts the importance on your Irish roots?
Yeah, for sure. And my father's side of the family again was, even though we didn't know the specifics, the myth at least was that they were deep Bronx Irish. Mm-hmm. They've been in the country, yes, the O'Briens had for 150 years, but they intermarried, essentially intermarried to the point of maybe some genetic harm. I don't know. So there was a very strong and very vague sense of how Irish that side of the family was, for sure. And my mother's side, again, was more complicated, but it was still a mixture of Irish, Welsh, Scottish, definitely a Celtic feel. She had has one famous ancestor, so I guess I do too, who is English, so not very Celtic, and he was famous. I don't know if I've probably told you this story. He has a plaque in Westminster Abbey. He was a poet named Christopher Anstey, and my grandmother's name is Ruth Anstey, so she's descended from him. And he was poet laureate for a time, and he wrote satiric verse about people visiting Bath, England, with various really satirical verse about the nouveau riche of his time, of his day, who were coming to Bath to take the waters for their various comical ills. I think the one family he made fun of was the whole family was there because they all had gastrointestinal complaints or something. And he was a best-selling poet. And of course, he's completely forgotten now. So there's a strong English sort of strain there, but the rest of her family, there's a lot of Irish too, But nobody too recently. I mean, the most recent is my father's mother's father came over at the turn of the century, 1908 or something. And he's referenced in the play from Stradone, which is really isn't a town. It's in County Cavan, and it's a fork in the road. And I've been to Ireland now many times. I'm going again in next month for a week, and I've never been to County Cavan or Stradone. It's kind of in the middle of, apologies to anybody Irish who might listen to this. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and it's
which is most of Ireland, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of Ireland is so picturesque.
It's all beautiful, but there's a middle of nowhere feel to a lot of it.
Yeah, that's true. Once you go to the big cities and you're like, this isn't a big city, you go to...
And it takes about 3 minutes to get from the big city to the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me that year I spent there, because I did get to act. I was joking with friends before I left that I wouldn't get to act unless they were doing, David Mamet plays at every amateur pub theater on the, And within a week, I was cast in Sexual Perversity in Chicago at the Cork Arts Theater. I think it was called the Cat Club, CAT, Cork Arts Theater, which was like around the corner from a brothel or something. A very small community theater, essentially. Now, community theater and amateur theater in Ireland is very different. There's a different feel. Like it's it's amateur. I mean, it's community like it is here, but it's more serious, or it feels more serious there.
Mm-hmm.
They're often people who are just starting out who end up going on to real professional careers and everything. But it is a pub theater, with a big pub right through the doorway from the theater, and everyone brings their drink in, and the first 20 minutes of every act is great because the audience is buzzing, and then as the act goes on, people are, looking for their next drink. And
Drifting. Yeah.
And people usually bring 2 or 3 drinks in with them and, put under the seat. So I did Sexual Perversity in Chicago, which was a fantastic experience to be kind of the cliched American for the Irish. Do you know what I mean? I was cast as Bernie, if you know that play, who's the more obnoxious and probably classically Memedian character.
That's what I was gonna say.
And early, I mean, this is like one of Mamet's first plays, right? If not his
Well,
first.
it's like the play that got him recognized for the first time.
And so, he's crass and he's vulgar and he's sexual and everything. And the director of the play felt like Cork, this wasn't Cork's, I already said that, but the Cork in 96 was like, his theory was that maybe it was like Chicago, in 76 when I think the play was first produced. Just in terms of where Ireland was in terms of women's rights and sexuality and things like that. And it's true that I think divorce had just been ratified that year when I got there. And, of course, abortion is still illegal in Ireland. And some of the, reviews, as far as I remember, they were fine, if good, but they were, very condescending about the Americanness in the play, all the shock value of the crude American dialogue. But then I got the chance to do a play where I played an Irishman, a guy from Belfast, in a play at Cork that we then toured to Belfast.
With an accent?
Yeah, I had to attempt a Belfast accent. So
that's got to be intimidating in the land of the people.
It was really terrifying. And I remember that I beat out a guy for the role who was from Belfast.
Oh.
But he was part of, this was actually through the university in Cork, University College Cork. And I sort of sneaked in because I wasn't just studying there, but I was, what else was I going to do, So I auditioned, and they were so excited to have an American. And then, because the play is about an American, an Irishman, and an Englishman in a cell in Beirut, Someone Who Will Watch Over Me by Frank McGuinness. And so originally they were going to cast me as the American, but I was better suited personality-wise for the Irishman. So they were like, well, let's just go for it. It's just a university production. So we switched it up after, I think, the first read-through. And we actually had another American in that production, but he'd been living in Ireland for like 8 years or something. So he was from Flushing, Queens, I think. So he had this, and he's gone on to a great career over there as a stand-up comedian, as an actor. His name is Des Bishop. And he, so it was very confusing to me because he sounded so American, but then he had this tinge of Cork. And the Cork accent is really lilting. It's like beyond anything. It doesn't even sound Irish if you're used to like just movie Irish. It doesn't sound Dublin. It's just it's urban, but it's like so lilting. It kind of sounds Swedish, or some people have connected it to the French influence just because of geographically where Cork is. And sometimes Des could sound, as the American, he could sound like he was from Cork by accident because he'd been there 8 years. So it was very confusing for the audience because as I was doing my attempt at a Belfast accent.
Which they could recognize.
Which, I heard different things. I heard people kindly saying that they knew I wasn't from Belfast, but they didn't think I was American, which sounded like a pretty good compliment to me at the time. And then when we did it in Belfast, I mean, I'm going to brag and say I was shortlisted for Best Actor in the festival, did not win, but was still called to task for my accent by the Belfast adjudicators, the critics. This one woman, she said, she was like, Dan O'Brien, I will attempt the accent a little bit. She said, Dan O'Brien, before we talk about your performance, what the fuck kind of accent was that? The whole place like erupted in laughter. They thought it sounded like Polish or something. Right. But in theory, the Belfast accent, the Northern accent, is supposed to be easier, and I think it is for Americans because it's much flatter and sharper, and the vowels are kind of. I just remember that like little words were helpful, like the word down. I remember it was supposed to be pronounced dine, like going out to dine, to dine somewhere. And so like switching I had a little trick where I'd always pretend I had I would imagine I had like a pill on the back of my tongue, and that helped a lot with the vowels, because the vowels are in the back of your mouth, and you sort of speak out the side of your mouth. It's embarrassing because I can't, of course, do it now. But it was talk about a great experience to be forced to pretend you're part of that culture, and just for a writer and an actor, and forced to pretend you're part of that culture by not just speaking the words that these characters might speak, but trying to speak the way they speak. I mean, that was huge. And I came home after a year, and friends were like, "Did you pick up a fucking brogue? Like, why are you talking like that?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I did. I must have. I picked up some little tinge of it, because you want to be understood. So one thing is, sorry, I'll stop talking. This is another way in which I'm Irish. Is if you get me going, I'll just keep talking. But
well, we are interviewing you.
I would say, people would ask me my name, and I'd say Dan. And because of the accent, they would think I was saying I was Den, as in Dennis.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people calling me Dennis. So little by little, I started saying I was Dan. Like I would sort of change the A sound a little bit, so they would say it, so they would understand what I was saying.
Right.
So in a larger sense, little vowel shifts and things like that happened.
How did that first year that first year of Ireland, because this is right after you graduate, mm-hmm. How did that time influence your writing, if it did?
I mean, it feels like it was huge for me, just personally and artistically, for sure. I mean, it just, again, I say again because you've seen or read the play, The House in Scarsdale, but I came from such a cloistered, agoraphobic household as a child. Like, to be able to leave the country, alone, mm-hmm. was just the height of freedom and terror too at times. Do you know what I mean? It was the nightmare of like everything I ever wanted. Mm-hmm. I could just leave like this, and that sort of metaphor is exactly applicable to how I thought and think about writing. In the sense of being able to have complete freedom, to do something scary, to be, which is what I connect to being as honest as I can, especially if I'm writing memoir in this case, or if I'm writing something documentary style, which I've been doing for a number of years now. But even before that, just in terms of even if I was writing a fiction or a history play, which I did for a long time, again, trying to be as truthful in a way that might be that might make the play a difficult play to please an audience, a difficult play to be produced, a difficult play to be reviewed. But, I still felt like, I don't know, like it was the right thing to do, to just sort of tell the truth, or to try to tell the truth about these characters. Because it was a slow dawning realization how much of art in general is lying, I mean, it's such a cliche that art tells the truth. And actually, no, for the most part, art, especially popular art, doesn't tell the truth. It lies to us all the time. And all the power to the liars, I often want to be lied to, too. And I'll watch things that I know are, full of shit and enjoy it.
Well, they're lies that are disguised as truth.
Yeah, and that's probably the worst kind. I mean, obviously there's, entertainment that says, don't take me seriously, and that's one thing. And probably the hardest thing are the forms of art that say, that this is something profound, or this is something truthful, and you feel lied to, Of course, that's all subjective, to a degree. But so no, the writing, and the other thing about going to Ireland for a year, that year, was also just learning to live like a writer, having that luxury, that privilege to, they didn't give you a lot of money, they gave you just enough money to get by, They gave everybody the same amount of money, and still do. This foundation, I think, is going on 40 years or something. Mm-hmm. And like my friend who went to North Africa, he stretched it out for a year and a half, because he was in countries where the dollar went a lot further. Whereas in Ireland, it actually didn't go very far at all. But it meant that I could write and act at 22, 23, full time. Think of myself that way. And then I went from there to grad school for the same reason. I thought to myself, okay, if if I'm going to do this, and I want to do this, I want to keep writing. I sort of want to keep acting, but I definitely want to keep writing. How can I do that without getting a full-time job doing something else, And there were a few programs at the time that had money, and just like there are now, I think some of them are the same programs, some of them are not. Some programs, of course, have some money, for some students. But at the time, I had heard that Brown and UCSD were really the best buys, in terms of being a great program, but also, Brown was tuition free and they gave you a stipend.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, I'll apply there. And I sent my application from, I think I printed it out in like a hostel, my script out in a hostel, sent it from Belfast. When I got to Brown, everyone was very confused because somehow it had gotten out that there was a political writer coming from Belfast. So everyone was wondering why I was this, 23-year-old kid from Scarsdale, New York,
Well, what was the play that made them think you were political?
Well, the play was the play that had won that National Student Playwriting Award. Mm-hmm. And again, it was kind of a mess. I think it was promising, for a 21-year-old who wrote it. But, it was political in the sense that it was about a family friend who died of AIDS, and he was closeted. It was very Angels in America,
Mm-hmm.
I don't even want to say influenced. It was beyond influenced. It was probably a ripoff of Angels in America. But it was kind of Tony Kushner meets Howard Barker. Mm-hmm. My undergraduate program was Middlebury College in Vermont. Small college, small program, great program. But one of the three main professors had and continues to have really lifelong obsession with the British playwright Howard Barker. So we were pretty much sort of steeped in Barker and Carol Churchill and a lot of the more political and intellectual playwrights of the 70s.
So did they think you were Irish?
Yes. Yeah. They totally did, and probably they probably thought I was gay because the main character in the play was this closeted gay guy.
And imagine this disappointment.
I know. They're like,
just a straight white guy from upstate New York.
Exactly. Not even upstate, from Westchester. That passed fast, but I think I probably was the first straight white male that Brown had for a while that I know of. So I went from thinking I was writing some pretty, again, I was very young, some pretty challenging, almost experimental plays, getting to Brown and thinking and feeling like I was the Neil Simon of the program in a way, because I was, because of where I seemed to fit demographically, but also because a lot of the writing at Brown at the time was, and not so much playwriting. I think playwriting was, because Apollo Vogel was still challenging and inventive, but still was concerned with telling a story, whereas a lot of the poetry and fiction was so postmodern that, and some of the playwriting was too, that it kind of, and there was no teaching of playwriting. Mm-hmm. It was you were just sort of meant to absorb whatever you could from those 2 years, so it pushed me towards actually wanting to learn some of the more, I guess, conservative ideas of storytelling. Because nobody was teaching it. Nobody was talking about it.
That's kind of... But Paula Vogel, who I've only had the opportunity to spend a weekend with doing a semi-bake-off thing, she has that power to teach without teaching, to get you to learn without realizing that you're learning, which I found in that 48-hour period. I found that incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, she's great. I should be clear that I probably just got to know her 2 years ago teaching with her at the Sewanee Writers Conference, because we co-teach there, and she came down, and so we taught together for 12 days, because when I was an undergraduate, she was on sabbatical. Mm-hmm. So she had just won the Pulitzer for How I Learned to Drive. So she was like, I'm out of here, and I think she was in residence at Arena Stage, and she was busy, of course. And Charles Mee was sort of her fill-in. Mm-hmm. And I loved working. So really, I had the most interaction with him as a playwright. And Aisha Rahman was the other playwright who was there. But it was a small program. It was 3 or 4 people alternating each year. Again, the other reason I went to Brown is because I wanted to continue writing poetry and fiction too. And acting. I mean, I did act while I was there. I acted in some Brown productions, some Trinity Rep in Providence, some of their MFA productions, and got in with some of those actors and directors. Like, I don't know if you know Eric Tucker, or he's the Bedlam Theater Company in New York, or Jenny Mudge, who acts all over the place. So it really wasn't until I moved to New York that I said, okay, I'm just going to focus on writing as opposed to acting. And partly that was just like, having to get real about having some sort of day job, which for me was temping, as little as I could to pay the bills, basically. So sometimes I meant, 10, 20 hours a week. Sometimes I meant...
But you made it pretty far post-grad before having to get, a job, a quote-unquote job.
Yeah, and from the very beginning, also thinking a big part of my job was like, okay, can I get... Like, when I moved to New York, I had gotten this fellowship at the Manhattan Theater Club, which was like another... It was good in terms of who I'd get to know, but it was also another chunk of money, not a ton of money, actually a very small amount of money, but enough to keep you going. And so, I was very conscious of a big part of my job being, okay, no one's going to pay me for the writing, and when they do, it's going to be very little money. So I'm going to spend a lot of my time, applying for things and trying to be creative and trying to make sure my applications for funding and for grants and fellowships and residencies and things like that, making sure that those things are well written and well thought out. And so that helped a lot too, in terms of not having to get a full-time job. Obviously people do it and need to do it. But I felt like it was so important to treat this as my full-time job, even when no one was paying me. And it's still the case. I mean, it doesn't, as you know, it's like you can be doing well as a playwright or as a poet, and you're still not going to be getting paid hardly anything. I mean, when I tell people what a play makes in terms of royalties or whatever, unless you're right at the top of the pyramid and have, a show that, let's be honest, happens in New York and wins a Pulitzer or a Tony or whatever, you're going to make not that much money.
But even that is fleeting.
Sure.
Unless it
Right.
continues or
Right.
gets augmented by some other thing, like writing a screenplay or having a tenure track teaching job somewhere.
Right. Yeah, so I was teaching a lot in New York, too, which was another way between the temping and the teaching jobs got better and paid better, so I could do less temping. Like, I think the temping stopped right after 9/11, but that's also because the temping that I was doing was for a bank, and they just lost a lot of business. And it was in 2002 that I went to Sewanee for 2 semesters in Tennessee. And so from then on, I just kind of either taught, wrote, cobbled together things financially, married a TV actress. That helps.
I have a question about that. So
Yeah.
you met as undergrads at Middlebury.
We did, yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So has your relationship been continuous ever since you started dating? So sounds like you spent a lot of time apart in the early years.
Yeah. We didn't really officially start dating till I came home from Ireland, because she was 2 years behind me in college, and of course I did that thing of professing my love right before I graduated, just to screw everybody's life up, So we had a kind of romantically tragic year of love.
That's kind of like marking your territory, though.
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
I'm
That's
going to be
true.
leaving
That's
soon.
true. Wait for me. I think I know we were both sort of dating other people at the time, so it was kind of a messy thing. But by the time I got back from Ireland, it was all sort of straightened out. We knew what we were doing, and but you're right. Yeah, a lot of it was long distance because she was still finishing up college when I was in grad school for a year. Then I had another year of grad school, and she was in New York. And then I spent, a couple of semesters teaching around the country, and so a lot of that was long distance. Or as you know, just being a playwright is an itinerant life.
Sure, yeah.
You're going to be away for weeks at a time if you have a production somewhere, or if you go off to, like in 2001, I did the O'Neill Playwrights Conference, and I'd never been to summer camp, as a kid, because my family was too, weird and wouldn't let us leave the house, and I was like, God, this must be what summer camp is like, because that's a month, and you could your boyfriend or girlfriend could visit, and I guess they could sort of stay over, but they couldn't like live there with you for the month, Yaddo, the residency that you've probably heard of. I spent a month in Saratoga Springs with that, and they're very strict about that. If you have a significant other visit you, you have to go to a hotel in town. They don't want any. I guess the idea is they don't want any conjugal relations or anything. They only want people cheating on their spouses. Right. These residencies. So yeah, we spent a lot of time apart.
I mean, it's kind of wonderful to hear about, because you just think about people in general in their early to mid 20s, just in their 20s in general. It's just like such a tumultuous period because you're learning how to exist as an adult for the first time. Right. And you're able to maintain this relationship, through that period.
I think we got lucky. I mean, I think we, there's also just something symbiotic in sort of what we both do artistically. That's very different and but also very similar on a kind of core level. And I derived so much. I mean, we met doing comedy improv. Mm-hmm. Seems silly to say because undergraduate comedy improv is about as embarrassing as like college a cappella groups. No offense to a cappella groups. But she and I were in the same comedy improv group with Jason Mantzoukas and a bunch of other people who are working today in comedy. It was a really talented group. But, as I got going and further along as a writer, I wasn't doing that, and I missed it, and it was great to sort of vicariously still have that in my life, and to go to, because she got started with the Upright Citizens Brigade pretty much the second year maybe they opened in New York, so pretty much like on the ground floor there. Mm-hmm. And
in that old space on 23rd or 22nd or something.
It was I think it was 22nd. Yeah, I'm not sure which was one of those, because then they moved up to where they are now, underneath the Gristedes there on 26th, I think, right? But I used to love, especially after like toiling away on plays that I hoped would be off Broadway, and going to see plays off Broadway with these very elderly, or what seemed to me very elderly audiences. So to go to the UCB and see a show for $5 with all young people in the audience, was a real, tonic or something, or balance, or, it kept me going in a lot of ways. And I'm sure informed a lot of what I wrote then. I mean, when I taught playwriting in my 20s and early 30s, I used a lot of improv philosophy and exercises and things like that. That was very important to me.
That was my entry point into the performing arts in general. Was taking improv classes in my early to mid 20s and joining an improv theater. And like as the B team, I'm part of the B team, the travel team, the off night performance, and just that has informed my writing today. Like Yes and is ingrained in my head. I'm not funny and I don't write comedy, but as far as like crafting dialogue and character, it all comes out of improv.
Yeah, there's something very pure about it, even if it's not the best show or something, it's and of course it's amazing. I remember Jessica was always talented, but there was one performance, after a few years where I suddenly felt like, oh God, she's got her 10,000 hours or whatever it is Malcolm Gladwell says, and to see a lot of her peers do the same thing, because of course the people she came up with, she still works with so many of them in out here in LA, and that was pretty much why we moved in 2008 to come out here, because she was getting relatively getting a lot of work in New York, but you can only get so much work in TV and film in New York, and there was kind of for her sort of generation of UCB people, there's this kind of migration happening, and I think they had just opened the first UCB theater out here, and improv, of course, pays less than poetry. I mean, it's they get paid nothing.
I think playwrights might make more than poets.
Yes,
and then improvisers are even farther down below poets.
Yeah. And probably novelists probably do better than playwrights, but maybe not. Depends. So that's why we came out here, because we felt like, if she was going to And also, I wanted to feel like, and I want to feel like I could write anywhere. I mean, we missed New York, especially for those first couple of years. But, I didn't want to feel like I had to stay in New York to write plays. I didn't want to feel like I had to write plays if I didn't want to. I mean, I just don't want to feel like chained to, I've written 3 collections of poetry, especially in the last, more so since leaving New York, and I like to think I'll attempt a novel or something. Or,
this is one of the questions I want to ask you, because you write poetry, you write plays, you've written a memoir. Mm-hmm. You just said you might write a novel. You wrote a novel, right, as an undergrad.
Right.
So, and we live in Los Angeles, and you're married. You have a spouse who works in film and television. Have you ever had that motivation to explore screenwriting or TV writing?
I hadn't. The only exception is something I did for Paul Watson, this reporter, this combat journalist I've been working with for years. I wrote a play about him, The Body of an American. I wrote 2 collections of poetry, collections as I call them, about his life as a war reporter and about our friendship. And a few years ago, maybe now even 4 years ago, he really wanted to try. For years he'd been saying, I want to get out of war reporting, as war reporters often say, and then he'd kind of get sucked back into it, And he wanted to get out of it because it was bad for his mental health and potentially very bad for his physical health, So, and he had this idea that if he could write about his experiences for TV or film, here's some way he could earn a good living for his family while still parlaying his life experience. He wouldn't feel like he was starting over in some other career. And he felt like I was the only one he knew in L.A., and of course he knew I was not a TV writer or screenwriter. But, we had enough sort of friendships and relationships that we could get a producer involved, and we could, get CAA to represent us, at least for the pitch. And so we put together a pitch about Western journalists covering Syria, because Paul had just been to Syria the year before. And so that's the one time I've sort of gone through that process. And this was after seeing Jessica, my wife, go through this process where, she's got a show playing house on USA that is going to the 3rd season. She had a show on NBC that, lasted 6 episodes, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, called Best Friends Forever. But before that, she'd sold and shot a few pilots for HBO, I think 2 for HBO. And so she's, I've been seeing her put together pitches and go on pitches and sort of, deal with that excitement and that stress, So I didn't feel like I was a complete newbie, And of course, I know lots of playwrights who have worked and work in TV. So, but at the same time, I've never worked in TV. So it was, and then I was pitching with a Pulitzer Prize-winning war reporter with significant PTSD, who, during these pitches would often break down or come close to breaking down, and they were fascinating meetings. I mean, I've done enough of similar meetings where I know, if it's not going well, it's over pretty quick. Somebody gets a phone call or a message from their assistant and they've got to go. And, these meetings, these went on a long time. And I think partly it was just because it was a different meeting for these executives, to be able to talk to Paul.
Yeah.
And to hear his pitch.
Well, he's a real person.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. He's not somebody just like me or like the usual TV writer has got a dozen pitches that, Now, of course, in retrospect, if we'd gone in with a very experienced TV writer or producer, we probably would have sold that pitch because in the end, nobody wanted it. What we heard back was that stories about journalism doesn't sell. And then I think 6 months later, Spotlight won the Oscar for.
Well, and Sorkin had a show.
Right. But whenever you bring that up, they're always like, "Well, that's Sorkin,"
Right.
Or they always have that exception because I think that show was running while we were pitching. So, I think it was more that it would have been an expensive show to shoot, and the people that brought it to them were 2 inexperienced TV people. A playwright, who, I guess was doing okay as a playwright, but wasn't the guy that wrote Hamilton, and then Paul Watson, who's totally outside of this line of work, So I think that was the challenge. Now, we could have kept trying. It was interesting that, I think Paul felt like a little demoralized by the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he sort of said, forget it. Because, we could have, of course, knowing what Jessica's been through, of course, I know, and knowing what playwrights go through, you have to write 5, 6, 7 plays before one maybe starts to get attention. And you have to pitch sometimes many pitches and many seasons, and just like actors, you have to get known by casting directors, and you have to get known by connect to people that connect to what you do. So I didn't have as many. I wasn't as optimistic maybe as Paul was about it, but that experience has turned into this new play I'm writing with him. At first, it turned into the new collection of poetry that came out last year called New Life, which is about his time in Syria. But it's also about he and I trying to sort of morph that experience into something for quote unquote Hollywood, for American mass consumption or prestige cable consumption.
I'm curious about, your play, The Body of an American, and the War Reporter collection of poetry. That was sort of my introduction to you as a writer. Like, I had known of you for a while, but I had never experienced any of your work, and I was fascinated by the way you told the story about how you were your own avatar in the story, and it was real. It was based on these real conversations, and you've continued that sort of form. And was The Body of an American the first time that you had written in that way?
It was. I mean, it yeah.
How did you get from what would be considered a traditional play to writing in this new form?
I think in some ways what got me there was what The House in Scarsdale is about. Having a period of intense emotional. In the play, the Dan character says, I had a breakdown or something when my family disowned me. And to some degree I did. I mean, I was completely functional, but when my family, and this is, spoiler alert, but I guess it's in the first scene of the play, but almost the entirety of my family stopped talking to me in 2006. So, that was, and on one hand, I was very happy about that. I felt freed by that. But on the other hand, of course, it was a trauma. It was just a shock and a trauma, and then to try to sort of understand myself anew after that shock. You lose your family. It's an identity crisis. Who am I? Who did I think I was to these people, and who am I now? So I think there's a few years of probably still writing in the old way as I was trying to kind of figure it out. But then this new way of writing in blank verse started, but also wanting to write more documentary style, but in blank verse, if that makes sense. Just kind of naturally, for me, started to develop. I don't think I'm going to be writing that way forever. I think it's really just these 3 plays. I think it's The Body of an American, The House in Scarsdale, and this new play, which I'm calling New Life. Those all seem to be of a piece, and they're different in many ways, but they seem to be something of a trilogy. And I'm writing some other new plays that are very new and very rough, where I'm not writing in blank verse, and they're more fictional. And so it's not like, I'm going to write this way forever.
Was there sort of like an aha moment, or was there?
Probably was.
Or did you have any kind of experience where you were like, this is a risk, not just exposing yourself, but to some people it could seem like you are, you're like, shining a light on you, like, look at me.
Yeah, with The Body of an American, for sure. When I realized that, like, I should be a character in the play, I did have that fear of, like, because it's not, it's not a new idea. I've seen it done before. So there was even that sense of, like, but yeah, for all the usual reasons, this is going to be self-indulgent or come off that way. Ultimately, though, because that seemed dangerous to do, it felt exciting to try to do it, and to sort of walk that line. And early drafts of the play had people saying, you need more of Dan in this play, and other people would say, get rid of Dan. Dan should not be in this play, So people had all kinds of opinions about whether or not you should do that or there should be more of it. With that play, I felt like Dan should be in the play, but the majority of the focus is truly on Paul and sort of Dan trying to relate to Paul. And there's really only that one big monologue. There's a very confessional monologue that Dan has in the play that connects very directly to The House in Scarsdale. The House in Scarsdale is the play that I like to subtitle Too Much Information, because it's like, okay, you want indulgent, you want self-indulgent, here it is. But again, the challenge was like, okay, but what? Like, memoir can be done well. It can be done really poorly. But memoir is, I read lots of memoir and have my whole life, and have found a great deal of solace and inspiration in it, So the idea that you just shouldn't do it because it's too self-indulgent, like, okay, maybe if it's done poorly, it is. And I'm sure some people will read that play or see it and think I haven't, pulled it off.
Well, what a lot of people don't know, if they aren't theater makers or playwrights, is that we are all writing that exact play. My character just happens to not be named Brian.
Right, exactly. And that was part of it too. I got tired of the mask, while of course still acknowledging that, like, Dan is a character. He's not me. I'm putting myself on stage, but I have to make a character out of me.
Was that a struggle at first? Were you? Because I noticed you are referring to the character as Dan.
Yeah.
Was that a struggle at the beginning?
No, it never felt
not say I.
No, it never felt that way. I think there was one day many years ago where I accidentally wrote a character's name twice in a row on the page, and that was like an aha moment as a younger playwright, where I felt like there's something profound in that. There's to have like either many characters playing the same person, or I don't know, it just felt like there's something, kind of deep in that, and so that's partly where it came from a desire to go to dramatize a more internal space on stage. I think there are great plays that involve living room couches, but if I were going to have a manifesto, it would be no more couches. Do you know what I mean? There's just so much theater that's so comfortable and naturalistic, and has been for as long as there's been an American theater. But, I find that often so boring, and I really want a theater that can, and when I say go inward, I don't mean characters just sitting around talking about what they're thinking and feeling. I mean, can go where our minds go, can deal with memory, can deal with, can range widely in terms of different characters, characterizations, even if you're only using, 2 actors or something. To me, that's intensely theatrical and asks a lot of imaginative work of a director and actors and designers. And, so I don't know where your question started, but
I don't remember either, but it made me think
though.
about how it connects to The House in Scarsdale now, because that play is such a, in a lot of ways, is a sparse blueprint, is a playground to hand off to a theater to then create, because it's not clear on the page what this play looks like. This.
But it does say, like I do say, it should be minimalist. It should be, just mostly light sound and projections. But you're right in terms of, more naturalistic setting and stagecraft. It doesn't really deal with that at all, and there are no stage directions, I don't think, in terms of actions. Anything that needs to be done. Part of that is because so much of it is about oral history, because it's based on interviews with estranged relatives of mine. So the scenes are adapted from that. So, part of the lack of stage directions is because we're dealing so much with people telling stories. And I hope they're telling stories in a way that's still dangerous and high stakes, and there's a mystery. But they're not necessarily doing a lot physically, and that's not true of every play. This plays a lot more that way. But So there are no stage directions and no pauses or silences. I just wanted to just put down just really focus on the words and let the actors do it. The actors, I mean, the way it's written in blank verse with no call for pause and silence, I think it often suggests a certain tempo and speed and fluidity, which in general is right. But of course, the thing's got to live and breathe, on stage in a human way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating play to see on the page and then to see on the stage and can then come back to the page and see it again, because there are moments where what is true, how it's structured on the page, how it appears, you then feel in the performance. And then that feels like it disappears for a while. But there are these moments where it comes back. Like the whole play reads extremely poetic, like it is poetry, but through the performance of it, the poetry sometimes takes a backseat to the performance, and then the poetry comes back up to the front again.
Yeah, I mean, there's for me, what I tried to let the scenes where Dan is talking to himself, so the two actors are both playing Dan, because that's truly an internal place. That could be more sort of lyrical and associative and poetic in some sense. Whereas the scenes of the interviews, if those become poetic, they're kind of accidentally that way, because again, they're derived very closely from the conversations I had, reworked that I don't even necessarily remember exactly what I have either paraphrased or fictionalized to some degree. But it was really important to me to keep, those things that we say in speech that you never see on stage. You know what I mean? Because of course naturalism is not real. It's not realistic. Naturalism is an illusion of the way we speak. And if you keep, even in that first scene, there are all these, the actors joke about it, there are all these rights. When people are talking, somebody else goes, right, mannerisms like that you don't see often in plays, partly because they can become filler, they can become just something that wouldn't be exciting on stage. But I try to keep it where I felt like it was interesting in some sense, maybe linguistically, but also in terms of character, to keep this sort of the strangeness and maybe accidental poetry of the ways people speak. So for me, at least, I don't know if that's what you meant by like moments when you are aware of the language or the writing or the poetry aspect versus maybe scenes when you're not. Because I feel that too, watching the performance and the interview scenes where they're doing such a good job that they, I really believe in the reality of this moment, even if it's on a sparse, minimalist, evocative set. I really believe in, and even if one actor is playing 20 characters or whatever it is, 15 characters, I really believe in almost the hypernaturalism of it, So the style that evolved for me really was, and it is a contradiction to some degree, but it's like a hyper-realism at one end and sort of poetry at the other end, and they sort of pull at each other. And that tension is just exciting to me. I don't know if, it's useful to me in terms of, writing in the process. But it is a tension between wanting to capture reality, and part of that is, and I know we're getting low on time, but part of that was moving to LA, I think too. New York is such a cliche, but my wife Jessica and I, we always talk about how we miss having fights on the street in New York and witnessing fights on the street, because you just see people falling in love and getting divorced, and everything's happening on the sidewalk. And you come to LA, and maybe it's where we live, maybe the West Side is quieter maybe than other places, but it's a cliche. You get stuck in your car.
Yeah, they're
in
fighting
house.
in the car. They're divorcing.
Exactly, they're divorcing in the car. So partly I wonder how much of the change in the way I was writing was coming here and wanting to write things that were more real, if that makes sense, because it put me in contact with my subjects in a way that was less lonely than being an LA playwright. Which maybe is the loneliest thing you could be.
Do you consider yourself an LA playwright?
I do, yeah. I take a perverse pride in, like in my bio for like a literary magazine, if they have a poem of mine, I'll write, Dan O'Brien is a playwright and poet living in LA or in LA or something like that, and I take a little Yeah, pride.
You think that culture's not happening.
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, we are out of time. I have about 50 more questions.
Well, see, I talk too much. So
and
couldn't get to them.
I have the luxury of being able to ask them of you off the air.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing this. I really
Sure,
appreciate it.
Of course.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you to Dan O'Brien for coming to the studio today. Go see The House in Scarsdale if you are in the Los Angeles area before June 4th, 2017. It's playing at the Theater at Boston Court in Pasadena. Go to bostoncourt.org for tickets and information. So here is when I bug you to go to iTunes and comment on our podcast. So blah, blah, blah. Go do that now. This is also the spot where I tell you to find us on the Twitters and whatever. Say things to us. You can go do that. We are at Subtext Podcast. I want to give a big thank you to LA Stage Alliance for starting their online magazine, thisstage.la, and for including the subtext on it for these past 2 years. Thanks, LA Stage Alliance. And thank you to David at JTB Studios in Atwater Village. I appreciate your constant flexibility with the scheduling here, and I adore the studio. Lastly, I need to give a shout out to Danny Oliver. She is literally the only reason this podcast exists. Danny asked me a while back if I wanted to be part of this new online venture she was in charge of, and I said yes before even knowing what I would do. We decided together to start a podcast and have collaborated on it ever since. She has helped in a million different ways, from helping pick a name to coaching me on how to conduct interviews, giving me notes when I'm heading in the wrong direction, and talking me off the ledge when I want to quit. Danny, you're awesome, and I'm so thankful to know you. I wish you all the good things as you move on to new ventures in your life. No doubt you will find success. All right, welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening.